Welcome to Reimagining Anti-Violence Work, a small space where we're going to unpack the big issues currently impacting the anti-violence field and collectively dream up a new future. Hello, anti-violence workers, leaders, and anyone else that's made your way here. I'm your host, Steph Klotz, a former anti-violence worker and a member of the We Deserve Better project. Today, I'm joined by Emil. Emil has worked in survivor support and violence prevention for over 20 years. They're white, genderqueer, and living with long COVID in Florida. They strive to bring abolitionist and liberatory values to all of their work. We'll be chatting about some of their experience in anti-violence work, including the good, the bad, and the ugly, although maybe not in that order. Welcome, Emil.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. So, before we kind of dig into all of that, a question that I ask everyone, I'm always so curious about this, is what inspired you to get involved in anti-violence work?
I always have to think about this question because I feel like there's not just one pathway. It was a bunch of different things happening one after the other at the same time. In high school, I was a peer counselor. I don't like no clue why I wanted to do that then. Who remembers being 15? But I loved it and have been, like on that path ever since. So working in hotlines and crisis support. And I think through that, like kind of focused in on anti-violence work in particular. At the same time, like as a teenager, my older sister was punk and I couldn't be punk because like I couldn't be the same as her, but she gave she gave me
Oh,
books.
siblings.
I know, right? I was like, it would have been really different if I hadn't felt like, oh, I have to be my own person. But she gave me like books on anarchism and like, Howard Zinn's People's History of the US. We grew up in a conservative town as a not conservative family. So I like very early on was getting a lot of tools and information on being able to like understand injustice in the world and name it. And I think that felt very important in like my growth in the anti-violence world and in the like survivor support world because in every basic like peer support training I would get or like domestic violence training it was like, oh, the cops don't work for everyone, and then tell people to call the cops. But like,
Yeah,
I felt like I had the kind of tools to notice that those things didn't match.
that's so
And
cool, Emil, because in my experience as a teen, I grew up also in a very conservative area, and my family wasn't one that towed the line or pushed the envelope either way. But I had a lot of formative life experiences where I saw firsthand the way I was treated by law enforcement was different based on who I
Mhm.
was with. And I didn't have that vocabulary to name it, right? So it's like kind of two opposite sides of the same coin of like seeing and knowing this thing and one of us having these like experiences with it but can't name it and the other having really just this like complex the vocabulary that you need to be able to really navigate through. So that's just what came up for me as I was listening to you.
Yeah, it really is amazing how much those tools and like kind of the invitation to just criticize or challenge or think about things in a different way, like how meaningful that is in our lives.
Yeah, so powerful.
I think the other like kind of confluence of stuff was my first paid job in, peer counseling crisis support was on an abortion hotline.
Mm,
And so there's this combination of like reproductive justice, anti-violence work, and then prison abolition that all those things kind of came together in my life a lot of like stuff I was really interested in, focused on. And, abortion hotlines aren't typically what we call anti-violence work, but when you're working with folks who are trying to access reproductive health care, you are working with folks who've experienced sexual violence,
yeah.
intimate partner violence, homelessness, incarceration, poverty, as well as wealth and, just
Yeah.
everything combined.
Everything combines. I used to do presentations for our local reproductive justice organizations because they're a high risk population. And also, because abortion can be forced for
Yeah.
domestic violence. It can be prevented because of domestic violence. So it's really, you're absolutely right. You can't undo the two from each other because they're so interconnected. Really, kind of that body autonomy, the, human rights aspects are so aligned.
Yeah. It's astounding how little the mainstream domestic violence field talks about reproductive rights and health. And part of that is like the history of federal laws and like gag laws and things like that, that historically said if you get federal funding, you can't do anything related to abortion, as well as state and federal pressure to like separate it out. But if domestic violence advocates got genuine, like reproductive justice grounded training, that would be so beautiful and so helpful.
Yeah, Emil, we could spend hours talking about the way the nonpartisan kind of, we have to be nonpartisan, right? For funding reasons, for community reasons. And also, there's one party that is promoting policies that negatively impact victims. And so when you're promoting gun rights, when you're against abortion, these things are things that harm DV victims. They're things that harm
Mhm.
victims of sexual violence, domestic violence. So it's really hard. I've always had a really hard time separating that, right? That it's like, okay, we're bipartisan, but this is such a huge piece of what we're doing. And it's not bipartisan, this big piece of it. So thank you for bringing that to the table.
People couldn't see, but I was nodding vigorously that whole time you were talking.
I love that. Thank you for the, sometimes I do a visual introduction when I do a webinar, kind of like sharing, I've got brown
Yeah.
hair, blue eyes, whatever. So yeah, we're both doing a lot of aggressive nodding at what the other person is saying. So, Emil, when we first met, you mentioned that you've got 20 years of experience in the field, and over that time, you've been employed at several different organizations that had toxic or sometimes even abusive work environments. And, I know our listeners know about the results of the survey. We've had another survivor on here, but I think it's always critical that we're able to kind of ground these numbers and thoughts into people's real life experiences. So I was wondering if you could share with our listeners some of the things that you experienced in those work environments.
Yeah. I always, I'll preface this like I do a lot of training and stuff in my job, so I always like want to have a coherent story or order to things. And honestly, like violence often isn't coherent, right?
Right.
So in preparation for this, I was like, okay, what are some key points I want to mention? And I like have this list, and like I just made a list of like most of the bad things that happen at jobs. And I was like, oh, cool. Right, that happens. And I was like, how do I convince people this is real? And I was like, I don't need to convince people of anything. But all of that to say, it's like often so much of our stories of like what's harmful in the workplace, there's all of this context that we have to set to make them make sense that we have that other people don't have. And so it was just like hard to kind of like narrate to myself of like, oh, I want to tell this, 5-year long story of this
Right.
one organization. And then this like 3-year long story of this other organization. That doesn't make sense. We don't have 8 years to talk.
Yeah. And
Um,
let me, sorry to interrupt, but I just want to kind of, that made me think about when someone's applying for a restraining order and they have
mhm.
like years of abuse history that they're having to like list it all out and how absolutely nonlinear it is and what a challenge that is for someone that works in the field, right? Is a testament to like what we're really asking people to do. So just had to mention that as it came up for me because it's hard. It's hard to dig back and be like, what was the abuse? What did that look like? How do I paint that picture?
Yeah. And I mean, so I still haven't like named any of this stuff, but like at a previous job, I reported something to HR, and HR is like the cops. Of that they want that linear narrative. They want a precise incident that they can focus on because that's the training. And HR is honestly, it's built to protect the system,
Yes.
kind of like the cops are built to protect the status quo. And so they weren't there to support me and my coworkers who were being treated terribly and discriminated against and harassed. They were there to make sure the organization was okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Um,
sometimes HR is even looped in as like a part of the abuse that
yeah.
it's like, with like improvement plans and like things like that, where they become
Mhm.
just another arm of the abusive leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. And they won't say anything affirm. So they won't say I believe you. They won't say I'm so sorry that happened. They won't. So you're just like, at least in my experience, I was just like talking to a wall who asked clarifying questions that I like couldn't necessarily say because how do you explain like the way that somebody has weaponized their silences or the way they look at you or the fact that they're constantly like, well, I don't know this fact.
Yeah.
Um,
And what you just described to me, Emil, those are all tactics of abuse. And
yeah,
so do
absolutely.
our HR don't have training on that, right? They
Right?
should. They should be
Even
able to identify it.
even at like intimate partner violence organizations where we talk about power and control all of the time when the power and control is internal, it's yeah. I think to kind of like get specific, some again, like it was funny making this list because I had put like some big stuff down, and then this morning I was like, oh, when I started, the biggest problem was that we were underpaid and undervalued. So I started this like national hotline making minimum wage, $7 an hour.
Yep.
They raised our wage when the like federal minimum wage went up. So
Mhm.
that was like the first raise that I got.
Wow.
Um, and yet they talked about the hotline as like the heart of the organization constantly, how important we were, all of this stuff. And that's true, like every place that has kind of frontline service providers is that they get the worst pay, the worst benefits, if they even get benefits. And then they're kind of glorified as like the heart and soul and the mission. But then that kind of escalated at this one organization. Our services got a lot bigger. So there was massive transition, new hiring, stuff like
Mhm.
that. And workers tried to unionize. And that was very significantly like union busted. We'd heard rumors of like union efforts like 5 years before any of us started that also got union busted. Our efforts failed. And there was a lot of like pitting people against each other in that process. So, whether it was directly tied to unionizing, I'm not sure if the organization actually knew we were trying to unionize or if they just knew we were up to something, but it was always blaming other workers, never blaming the system. So if someone called out sick, we were encouraged to like be annoyed at that person because it increased the rest of our workloads. And yeah, now I have like way more work to do. That really sucks. I'm exhausted and tired. But like if I had the time and energy and capacity, I could realize like that's not this other person's fault.
Right.
That's the system for not hiring enough people. And, there was like just so much stuff that kind of seems silly now in retrospect of like, this was in DC, there was a blizzard, snowmageddon,
Mm.
and snowpocalypse.
Yeah.
We were a national hotline, so they didn't shut the hotline down. This was before remote work. And some of us, those of us who could, whatever that means, walked to work at like 6 in the morning
Yeah.
after a blizzard when the metro, the streets are all closed. And then the organization was like, okay, maybe we'll like order you pizza for lunch. The only place that was open, I think, was Papa John's, who is notoriously anti-abortion. So they were like, but you can't have Papa John's because it's anti-abortion.
Oh
Like,
my God.
you know, sure, I also boycott places, but like
Yeah.
there's a blizzard. Um,
Yeah, I too have walked to when I was the shelter advocate, 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. I too have walked to work in a blizzard, pulled the double and triple shifts and all of that kind of that for the mission. And just the real lack of, yes, I understand the agency needs to keep going. I understand we can't shut down. And for shelter, you do need someone there in person. But what you just said, when you said before remote work, that made me laugh a little because I have a friend that's been working remotely for over a decade. for 15 years. And when COVID happened, she was at an organization that was like fully prepared for it because they'd been doing work remotely. So it was before our organizations were willing to acknowledge
Mhm.
how remote work would benefit their organizations, right? And unwilling to change and adapt to something new. It wasn't before remote work existed, right? So it's like just wanted to point that out because I think there are a lot of things in this world that would benefit nonprofit work that it's different. We don't do that. It's not, and yeah, I mean, you need to be able to answer the helpline from home when
Yeah.
there's a snowstorm, most especially. Doesn't make
Mhm.
sense. So sorry to go off on that
No.
soapbox tangent, but a lot of things are possible that we just fear of change.
Yeah, and there's so much, I mean, we could structure our system so much differently. And I know we'll get to that later, so I'll save it. But I think other examples that I feel like are important is like there's bullying, outright bullying, there's constant gaslighting, a lot of like weaponized incompetence of, bosses and supervisors just being like, well, I don't know. And it's like, I just told you, I can tell you again, what don't you know?
Mm.
But there was also like a lot of sexual harassment.
Oh,
And the same as the snowstorm organization, my last day at that job, someone else had reported somebody for sexual harassment. So I got called to HR to like, give the what did you see? Do you know about this kind of
yeah.
testimony on my last day? And it was a woman who'd harassed another woman or women. And HR was just like shocked that that could even happen. Like this was a majority women organization that like now had a few trans and non-binary folks and like, two men that worked there. And they just like had never even occurred to them that sexual harassment could take place in a majority women workplace.
Like,
And
is that like how lesbians can't be in an abusive relationship, Emil? Like,
yeah, or
don't.
like we don't. I'm listening to a book about astronauts right now. If we send an all women crew into space, we don't have to worry about relationships.
But you will need 10 million tampons.
Yeah, and they never even thought about like consensual workplace relationships
Right.
either. Despite the fact that previously two straight people had been married at the organization, there was no policy about like was it okay to date people or not consensually, as well as they just like were not prepared for sexual harassment. And I mean, that investigation, it was just so bad. They were just so dismissive. So, like, I don't believe you. You know, one of our lawyers is a lesbian. So, obviously, this place is queer friendly, kind of shit that made it really clear to me that there would be, not be reporting sexual harassment there. Later on, after I left, that same organization had a like massive, more publicly known sexual harassment issue with like a full-time staff person who was a man targeting a bunch of hotline workers and also had like, terrible stuff coming out about the executive director who openly had called the hotline the B word multiple times. So some people finally got a tiny bit maybe held accountable. That organization also got their union. The hotline is unionized, which is super awesome.
That is really cool. And
Um,
actually, I love that you keep bringing that up because we have an upcoming podcast episode about unionizing. And also, the We Deserve Better Project is creating a survey for folks that have either thought about unionizing, unionized, attempted and failed. So it's definitely an up and coming topic in the field. And so I love that you have some experience with that as well and saw that come to fruition. Unions are one of the really viable options, let me say. Nothing's right for everybody, but one of the really viable options for some powerful change. So, Emil, first of all, I'm so sorry that you had those experiences. And I also want to thank you for sharing with us. I know you kind of gave an umbrella view, right? We know there's not time to go into the 20 years of history of abuse. But anytime we're able to hear directly from someone that's had those experiences, I think it is a privilege. And I think it helps us really have a better understanding for what we're up against and what's really happening. So thank you so much. I know it's never easy to kind of go back in and tear into those wounds. So I really appreciate that. Thankfully, our listeners can know that you are now working at an organization where that is not the case. And what this episode is going to be titled and what comes up for me is, so you're saying there's a chance. I don't know if you've ever seen
I
Dumb and
almost spit out
Dumber,
my coffee.
but it makes me, it's one in a million. So you're saying there's a chance. That's how I feel about you and your positive workplace, Emil. So can you share some of the things that make that culture a healthy one?
Yeah, absolutely. It is such a relief. I mean, first there's no perfection under capitalism. We shouldn't have perfection anyway. But I think it's such an amazing shift to work at an agency that has a stronger understanding of trauma. Like we do survivor support work, we train and support anti-violence workers and organizations. And I've been doing that for the past however many years at so many organizations, and they just never thought about trauma in terms of their own organizations and teams.
Right.
So, we're able to talk to each other. I've had several conversations one-on-one with my boss or with our team where I'm like, I would like X because when this other thing happens, it reminds me of these bad bosses I've had. I'm distrustful when my boss holds themselves to a different standard than workers because in the past people have been like, "Oh yeah, it's fine to take time off," and then you get punished for it. Right? So being able to name that out loud is just really nice.
Yeah.
I think the other things that really help are benefits and pay. We have unlimited sick leave, which is incredible. And as a majority or possibly all disabled team, I know I use it.
Mhm.
and and it's scary sometimes to be like, is this real? I don't have to actually try to make up this time. I don't have to work when I feel terrible. Wow. And I think also just having the ability to change things as we need to. So, we're a very small team. So, some of these may not be relevant to larger organizations, but, we weren't having regular staff meetings. And that's something that's really helpful to me is being able to talk to the whole team who's all working together on stuff. And so we started doing that. And then we've kind of adapted those and what's included in them based on people's needs. And we're able to still set boundaries. So it's not one of those everybody knows everything about everybody. You have to share all of your personal life kind of stuff. It's you could, but you don't have to. And you're still a trusted and valued employee. And I think just showing that staff are valued, showing that consultants and outside folks that we hire are valued, we're gonna make sure people get paid and paid as well as we can,
Yeah.
and having access on trainings and webinars, having ASL in Spanish and stuff like that all kind of contribute to this more positive culture.
And I think, that culture, it kind of it's like an ever-blooming flower, right? Versus a toxic culture is an ever-blooming flower of that toxicity. And so it just kind of whatever you're putting energy into kind of makes it bloom more and more. And all of the things that you were talking, benefits, pay, leadership that integrates feedback into their approach. These are things that make any workplace amazing. And I think the first thing that you mentioned, this ability to talk about your past trauma and feel safe and supported in that. I also am at a workplace where I maybe didn't talk about my trauma of my previous job, but it became apparent that when I first started, I was really struggling. Just like you were said, you're so sensitive, right? When you leave an abusive relationship, it's like, oh, don't date anybody for a while, right? You need to heal. When you leave an abusive job, you're like, I gotta pay my bills, right? So you have to
Yep.
dive right back in. And so those areas where is this abusive or am I really sensitive are confusing. And so to be in a place that is supportive, whether they're just trauma informed and respond to you in a way that's supportive, or you're able to really talk about it with your coworkers and be supported in that way, to me, that was how I was able to actually be able to move on and heal a little bit from my experiences because all of the things that you said are, make an amazing workplace. And as someone that was healing from abuse in the workplace, that first one is the real game changer. And I don't know if what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. Absolutely. And just even if it's not like explicitly talked about, when we talk about a place being trauma informed, it's like this underlying assumption that people will have experienced trauma and it will impact them. So like if people are anxious or standoffish, rather than assuming they're like a mean person, I'm like, oh yeah, there's probably been stuff in your life that's like contributed to this. Or like you just haven't had coffee today or whatever. I'm thinking about just like how long workplace trauma impacts us. I mean, there have been several organizations since the one I mostly focused on. That one I focused on, like, still affects me. The ideas of like how we show up are like what our value is still come up for me. And then like more recent workplaces, even more so. This one job, there was intense pressure to just constantly work and perform and
Mm.
do, and you sort of like proved your worth by how much you could do.
Yeah.
And then the next workplace, I was like dramatically overperforming and then got long COVID, and it just shattered
Mm.
me to be like, oh, I can't produce like I used to. What's my worth?
Oh gosh, I
And
hate the way that self-worth is tied to productivity. It's just so backwards.
yeah, and it's I mean, it's something that, still like 3.5 years out from this like big change in my life. I'm like still unpacking. I've done like a lot of work around. So I think all of that kind of leads to like these past traumas, we know that they'll come up again, even when we're like feel pretty healed and we're doing well, stuff will remind us of it. And it's like also messy and complicated. As I was preparing for this, I was like, oh, some of these things that happen, make me feel really terrible. And sometimes I have this like gleeful, like, I want to get revenge on this, like this organization that pissed me off. Like, yes, I get to out the dirty laundry feeling. And, that's not generally how I want to live my life of
Sure.
like, but like, it's okay that those complicated feelings happen and that we can both retreat into ourselves and move outwards and like be angry and be whatever else we
Yeah.
are.
It's like those stages of grief. And I think having 13 years of experience directly with survivors, there are survivors that it can feel good for the person that caused you harm to finally have accountability. I
Hmm.
don't see that as revenge. To me, some folks are turned off by that. They're like, oh, she's happy that he got arrested or whatever. And I think, well, what's the perfect victim supposed to do? They're supposed to be, I'm
Hmm.
very glad that that happened, but also very sad for him. We'd be upset about that too, right? It's
Yeah.
like, so I think, I just a little self-compassion in how you think about
Hmm.
that because I don't see it as revenge. I think it's like telling our stories helps bring the darkness to light, and silence only protects the person that caused harm, honestly.
Yeah.
So it's not something about your character, but really just can be part of the healing process to kind of share, like, this is what happened to me. And no one said I'm perfect. In fact, I think you hit the nail on the head is like perfection doesn't exist. And we know it's a tool of white supremacy culture and a million other things, right? But when we don't have that self-compassion for ourselves in our healing and the grieving process, it can be even more challenging as a survivor of that workplace abuse to move on. So, um, yeah, there's a lot of confusing, mixed up feelings that don't even belong in the same room together that you're feeling at the same time.
Yeah.
And it's always whenever I have these like conversations with myself, when I'm like DV counseling myself, I'm like, oh my gosh, like it is so much easier to see when you're outside the situation,
Hmm.
right? It's just so much easier.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do think absolutely to everything you said. And I think it's okay that we sometimes have thoughts that are more revenge than accountability.
Sure.
Like there's definitely a boss and some other people that I will have thoughts of like, oh, I want them to suffer. And it's like, that's like a feeling and I'm not going to act on it. And yeah, if it happened, I probably wouldn't actually be happy. That's not the kind of justice I want to see in the world. I do want the accountability you talked
Yeah.
about, but it's okay. Yeah, everything you said, it's okay that we have these feelings of like a more intense revenge. And that doesn't mean we have to act on them, but we can acknowledge them and they don't make us bad.
Yeah.
And yeah, same that all, this happens with all types of violence and harm of whether it's intimate partner or
Yeah.
workplace or some combination of both.
Exactly.
Um,
So, how did you keep the hope? Because you mentioned that the first organization you talked about, it seems like there were some really severe dynamics of abuse going on there, and that you had several more kind of negative experiences after that. And so I'm wondering, how were you able to maintain hope through that process to eventually get to a culture where it's a positive workplace?
yeah, to some extent, there was not necessarily hope, but just like, this is what I can get a job doing. So I'm gonna keep working in this field, like at some point, especially when I moved out of DC and to Florida, like there are limited job options
Yeah.
for, trans folks in this state and with my like level of expertise. And I don't think like my hope is necessarily what led to me getting to work at a good workplace because like lots of people have hope and there are very, very few jobs at supportive workplaces because there are very few supportive workplaces. So like not everybody, until we change the system and we have better working conditions, there are going to be a ton of people who don't ever get to experience that. And that's terrible and sucks. And I think all of the work I've done professionally is grounded in like my values and beliefs and what I want to see in the world and like kind of bigger, broader social change and organizing work and knowing that like we need to change the conditions of society in order for people to like not experience violence, in order for people to have their needs met. We need some pretty like massive change. So I feel like that connection to something that feels a lot bigger than me, being a movement-based connection has been really critical. It doesn't have to be this way.
Yeah.
And that's been really important. And so like reading and learning from and talking to other people who like also are imagining different ways that things can be, whether it's like hearing about small organizations that do things totally different or like ways that people are supporting survivors outside of like mainstream domestic violence programs. How are people getting housing that isn't just like getting on a HUD wait list for 8 years? um, all of these like really creative approaches have been super helpful to me. And whether that's like also fiction or nonfiction, I think making sure that I'm always listening and learning from people who are different from me, who have different experiences, different approaches, different identities is really helpful. There was some point where it was pointed out to me, or I noticed, or some combination of both, that like my knowledge is very US based. And it's like, wait, what do other people do about this? Like, is the system the same? Like, how are folks supporting survivors? What does intimate partner violence look like and survivor support look like in other countries? What are people doing? There's so much we can learn from and so many different ways to do things. So that's been really helpful to me. And then I think like on a more personal side, I was in with my coworkers. We took this course from Rockwood Leadership Institute that was like mostly focused on like coming up with a mantra to help like ground your leadership skills. And I never got around to a mantra, but like one of the words that came up to me, oh my God, now I'm not going to remember it. Exuberant. So like that was like a word that kept playing in my head, partly because it's what some people have used to describe like how queer nature is. Y'all, nature is gay AF. But it also like brings to mind this sense of wonder. And so I think trying to support myself to approach the world with a sense of like wonder and curiosity and exuberance has been really helpful of like there's so much I don't know and isn't that cool? And there's so much we could do differently. Isn't that cool? That's helped me stick it out, especially this past year where I've been at a really good workplace, but like the world has sucked really bad, particularly for trans folks and a whole lot of other communities.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that because I kind of share that same mentality that it could always be different. There's always something that doesn't have to be this way, and that idea of something larger than ourselves. You just mentioned that about our current climate being so harsh to the trans population. I was just so grateful that you had this protective blanket of a workplace that was supportive versus perhaps some other folks, maybe even some of our listeners who might be navigating societal discrimination and then also within their workplace and amongst their coworkers with no outlet to HR and just this idea that even that one supportive person system can really make a difference in like the way that the impact of that violence hits. So I'm not thankful that our world is the way it is, but I am thankful for pockets of care and support and vision forward exist, right, in this place.
Yeah. And I will kind of plug two organizations, Forge and the National Institute of LGBTQ plus survivors are co-hosting groups for LGBTQ plus advocates to
Awesome.
as like kind of like a community resource to brainstorm and problem solve around what's happening at the federal level, how it's impacting survivor support, how it's impacting individual like advocates who hold those identities as well as the folks we work with. So those, for any queer and trans folks out there who are feeling isolated, like those are two great organizations to connect with or like,
Yeah.
spaces to be in.
We'll drop those links in the show notes for anyone that's interested so that they'll be able to easily connect to that support group and to those organizations. So, Emil, do you have any advice? Let's say we have somebody that's been listening in, they're like, oh my gosh, this sounds like exactly what I've been going through, and I'm navigating this toxic or abusive work environment. Do you have any advice for advocates that are in that situation?
My first one is just like talking to each other. What we were just naming, community makes such a difference. And it could be somebody at your workplace or somebody outside of it. At my last job, I had one coworker who like we would just check in after every meeting and a chance to be like, did that really just happen? Was
Yeah.
so useful. Like the amount of gaslighting that was happening and somebody else to say like your perception of reality is correct was a game changer.
I just had a memory bubble of like a coworker that would want to voice record her supervision meetings so that she couldn't be gaslit later. It's like when we start thinking about needing to record our meetings with our boss so that they can't gaslight us, it's just such a different level.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes well. My next idea was like research, and some of that is like, how do you protect yourself at jobs? And there's like, I've followed a couple like kind of workplace advocacy tools that, have recommendations for like, if you think you're being investigated by HR, here's what to do. And like recording stuff, keeping notes, getting things in writing are helpful tips. So kind of figuring out based on your situation what you can do
Yeah.
and having that like safety plan strategy. But another example of how research is helpful is again this first organization I keep talking about. We were for a long time we were all like part-time. And so we had no benefits, but we were in DC, and DC said that, if your organization is over a certain size, all employees got paid sick leave.
Mm.
And one winter I was like out sick a bunch and I couldn't afford it. And I looked up the law and I wrote an email to my boss that was like, per DC law, I am using my sick leave for the time that I was absent. We didn't have sick leave,
Oh my
but
gosh.
then we got sick leave because I was like, actually, we do have sick leave. It's the
Yeah.
law. And it's that might be like a rare situation where your organization is breaking the law and you can prove it
Mm.
and convince them for it. But if you have the position to be bold and just assert your rights, like do it. And
Yeah.
researching like what your rights are can be really helpful in that.
Yeah, it's like any victim, knowing your rights and options, because the person that is trying to exert power and control keeps that from you on purpose. They
Hmm.
don't want you to know your rights and options.
Absolutely.
So yeah, you got to
Yeah.
look that up yourself. Advocates, watch out leadership because advocates are going to advocate.
Right. And the person trying to exert power and control probably can pay for expensive lawyers who are going to lie to you about your rights and options and try and scare you.
Correct.
So yeah, doing your own research or like getting support, I there's tons of stuff I don't know how to do. We met with somebody from a union because none of us had organized a union. I talk to my coworkers to understand what's happening or people outside of our jobs because a lot of us get really isolated. Particularly right now, I work primarily with trans folks or people supporting trans survivors, and trans and non-binary advocates are super isolated unless they're at an LGBT specific organization. So sometimes the connection, the community we find is outside of our jobs.
That makes sense.
And I think the other thing is just like realizing we are planting seeds for the future and we may not see that thing happen, but like I firmly believe that our efforts to unionize, as well as the efforts 5 years before us, led to the union that came like 10 years after my time there.
100.
And even if none of us actually knew each other, that work makes a difference. And that can be hard because, again, complicated, messy feelings, sometimes it's like, well, why didn't I get the nice thing? Like, what? Why can't I have this? Or like, I want credit for the work that I did, and like, I'm not going to get credit for it. Nobody necessarily even knows what we're doing, but I think realizing how we can shape stuff, even, conversations with a boss where we ask about sick leave may lead to them doing research and bringing it to a boss and like change 3 years from now, but that's still worth it.
Yeah, I personally love the planting seeds analogy, and I use it when I talk about screening for domestic violence, right? And it's this idea of planting the seeds is the work. Just as like you're a squirrel in the fall, and you are just planting acorns wherever you can find a spot to put them. And you're not going to wake up to a big, beautiful oak tree the next morning. Maybe that particular seed will never become an oak tree, but your job is just to plant the seeds, right? And I think that to me helps mitigate that fatigue that we feel, that all I had to do was just plant this seed, goal accomplished. I don't need it to grow into an oak tree to feel good about it, right? I don't need to, this union doesn't need to be successful for this to have been a really powerful thing that my coworkers and I did, right? The agency doesn't have to have changed its policy for me raising my voice about it to have been really powerful and important, to not let this like what we define as a victory, right? To, that victory is just the work of planting the seeds. So we've got a lot in common, Emil.
Yeah,
It's been really nice chatting with someone who's so
absolutely.
values aligned.
Yeah. I think what I love about that too is like that we don't have to plant all of the seeds, like it takes a team. So they were like, I wrote this one email. Somebody else's very amazing and snarky, like, I'm quitting email was the like hinge that, led to some other massive changes at an
Right.
organization. Like, all of us play these different parts. And like, if we're looking at planting, there's people might know some about different crops. Somebody is like really good at weeding. Somebody has the big picture of crop rotation and soil and stuff like this. And somebody else is like really invested in one particular piece of that.
Yeah.
We get to play different roles, but like our knowledge together kind of compiles.
Yeah.
Um,
Because we know we need the community. It's all
yeah.
about that. Always comes back to that.
Yeah.
So before we close out, I'm wondering, do you have any recommendations for funders, leaders, change makers as we're reimagining this work, picturing a different future?
The scramble for funding in anything is so outrageous to me.
Um,
Do you know how much money we spend on like tax breaks for billionaires or for like genocide or the military or anything else? Like, we have the money
yeah.
to fully and beautifully fund housing and food and anti-violence work for like everybody. So if you are in charge of funding, like release the funds and fund so that like staff are well paid and get good benefits while paying attention to disparities between like frontline staff and executive directors.
Yeah.
We should not have organizations where executive directors are making hundreds of times more than frontline staff, or as is the case of one organization I worked at and you've interviewed somebody about before, executive directors steal tons of money. Yeah, I think that makes a big difference, as well as like funding what survivors need.
Mm.
There's always these like hoops to jump through of like, how do you prove that you spent the money on housing? It's just give survivors cash, give
Yeah.
survivors housing, give people what they need. I know that like a lot of people listening probably are not in charge of millions or billions of dollars. So we other things that we can do are really like placing value on our values and on the way that work happens, not just what happens, but like how it happens, how we care for each other. It's not just did a survivor get a referral, but like did that referral meet their needs? Were they able to access it in ways that were meaningful? Were staff able to spend the time with them to help them like make a phone call if that's what they needed help with? Kind of shifting that perspective
Yeah.
on how we
So
measure
like what I'm hearing is like a qualitative approach
yeah.
to your statistics rather than people being a number, their experience, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know that I've heard that before, but I love it so much. So many times we brush people's experience under the rug because we've served so many people and
Hmm.
um yeah, we don't want that to get lost in the sauce. The way the work happens is so much more important than the number of people served.
Absolutely. And just, it makes such a difference. And most of my direct service work has been on hotlines, having somebody answer the phone and sound friendly. It seems obvious, but it makes a huge difference to really like take the time to listen to people what they want and need. And ideally, we would have the funding to meet their needs after we listen. But,
Yeah.
having the time and the energy to listen is important. I think creating a culture that's like invested in learning and growth and like self-reflection or self like checking. I know that I have not always been the best boss or supervisor. Like I have done some crappy things and I can see why I did them. I was rushed, I was overwhelmed, I was getting pressure for things to be a certain way. So I just like did whatever I was supposed to do. But like if we can create a culture where people have the time to like pause and breathe before making assumptions, if we can have a culture that encourages supervisors to learn about how to supervise, how to, unpack our own trauma so that we're not repeating it, so that we don't take that out on other people, whether
Yeah.
it was like I was stressed, so I blamed somebody else for something, or like I've talked to people in hiring roles now who are like, nobody wants to work these days. And then they tell some like horrific story about walking to work in a blizzard or like missing their kid's birthday or whatever else. And they're like, nobody wants to do that. And it's like, yeah, nobody should have to do that. I'm so sorry you had to do that. Why are
So,
you hiring based on whether people will tolerate the abuse you put up with? Like,
what do you mean no one wants to miss their kids' important events and walk to work in the snow? I'm very confused. We know that when we are forcing people to work for low wages with these ridiculous requirements, that it's not that appealing, right? Even when you're able to say for the mission.
yeah, absolutely. And there's so much overlap when we think about like survivor support and our worker rights of where do we place the blame? And it's like we need to place the blame on the people doing harm and on the systems that perpetuate and encourage that harm and enable it. I was thinking Anne Helen Peterson, I think is her name, writes about workplace stuff. And she used the analogy of like guardrails versus boundaries. And so boundaries are something like we have to assert ourselves, and that's great and lovely, but we can't boundary our way into a healthy workplace because the problem is the system and the institution. Guardrails are things that, they're like the things on the side of the road that prevent you from falling off the hill.
Right.
So workplaces need to have guardrails that promote worker safety and well-being. So guardrails are like unlimited sick leave and like policies that, make it very clear that you take your time off or no meeting Fridays or like
Yeah.
actually meaning it when you say like you don't need to check your email after work or whatever. Guardrails are the things that the workplace can set up. And so really shifting our perspective as folks who, anyone who has any control over what happens in the workplace, like thinking about what the workplace can do for workers.
I love that. And I love that you say anyone that has any control because you don't have to be leadership to be able to be a
Right.
part of that. If you supervise folks, it's going to be more challenging to be a positive supervisor in a toxic system, but you still have opportunities to put in those guardrails for your workers, and to protect them from some of these things. So I love that adjustment of the framework and how we think about it, right, with boundaries and guardrails and all these different pieces that are needed for the system to really change.
Yeah, I think of it a lot. Like, I worked in domestic violence prevention for a long time. Like, that was my sole focus. And it's not just educating people about like healthy relationships. It's about creating a society that supports and encourages and creates the conditions in which it is easy for people to have positive relationships of all kinds with each other. So that means that everybody has housing, everybody has food, everybody has healthcare. That means that it's okay for people to talk about their feelings. It means that there's not inequality. Um, and so when we can kind of look at that bigger system, I think we really get to some of these root causes and shift things.
And I think that having a vision for what we want it to look like, even if we don't know exactly how to get there, is really important as a driver forward. Because the people that wanted to go to space didn't know how they were going to do it. They were like, I want to go to space. I'm going to go to space. And then they figured it out, right? So we want this. We want a system that places humans over the dollar, that places humans over everything, community, humanity. And my gosh, it is so wildly different from the system we are
Mhm.
in now that it can be like, I've heard so many times because Emil, again, this is another thing that we really share the same vision for is this like people call it Narnia. And I've been, but had people try to take the air out of that balloon so many times. That's not the way it
Mhm.
is. That's not the way it has been. And frankly, I don't give a damn about
Right?
that. The way it has been sucks. It effing sucks. And
Yeah.
so let's let's not limit ourselves, right? Let's hold dear this vision for the future and figure it out along the
Yeah.
way and be okay with making mistakes and growing and learning and unlearning and failing and trying again and all this stuff that we need in order to move forward.
Yeah, one thing that's been really helpful to me and important is like learning from other movements. And two that come to mind are like prison abolition and climate change, climate justice movements. An organization called Interrupting Criminalization has been doing 1 million experiments. And so much talk about prison abolition is similar. Like, we are building the future we want to see. We need to create it, we need to experiment. We try all of these different things, and together they create this beautiful future. So that idea really plays into what you were just talking about for me of like, we need the right to like play and experiment and try things. And that builds our future. And I think something I've been learning, from climate justice work is a lot about like what gets people engaged. There's been a lot of thinking of like climate change feels so overwhelming to folks that it's often folks are just like, there's nothing I can do. What's even the point of recycling because the world's on fire? Fair. And everything that we do does make a difference. And so I don't have like a catchphrase from it, but like just reading and listening to climate justice organizers who are envisioning the future, and there's a bunch of books that have done this of different essays and things like that, has been really helpful in thinking about there's so many different ways that we can do this work and ways we can engage. And we may or may not see that change happen, but it's possible. So, when we're feeling stuck in our pockets, our communities, our organizations, getting a broader perspective, whether it's from other social justice movements or whether it's from science fiction or our friends or whatever it is, I think can be really helpful in, yeah, just giving ourselves permission to like try.
Yeah. I think that's so critical. I think yeah, there's always so much more we can learn from others. And that's, hopefully what we're going to be getting out of these conversations is everyone with their perspective kind of cumulatively coming up with this vision for the new future.
Yes.
I want to thank you so much for joining me today, for sharing your experiences in positive and maybe not so positive work environments, and most especially for your visions on how to navigate through that and to make the best anti-violence field that it can be.
Yeah.
Hopefully, all you out there listening learn something, were validated in your own experiences, and maybe even feel a glimmer of hope for a brighter future for anti-violence work. If you or someone you know is interested in joining the We Deserve Better project or in being a guest on the podcast, check out the show notes for details on how to connect. Thanks for listening. Remember, anti violence work is neither anti violent nor working to end violence. So keep talking and reimagining amongst yourselves.